Today on Conversations Aloud, we're discussing what is driving the friction between the US and China. We're joined by Zheng Huang, who is the founder of a fintech firm in Shanghai and an education company in America. He's also served as the White House Fellow under President Obama, and he's the former president of the Committee of 100, which is a nonprofit organization that has prominent Chinese Americans dedicated to strengthening the U.S.-China relationship, and it does feel like it does need some strengthening. His newest book, which is Rethinking China, Challenging Our Economic Assumptions and Opportunities for Lasting Prosperity, deep dives into how we got here. Welcome to the show, Z.
Oh, thank you so much, Eddie. It's a real pleasure.
Great to have you on. So we'll go straight into it. When did the U.S.-China relation really deteriorate, and why? Because I'm sure it wasn't always like this. There was a period where, there was a good relationship, trying to help each other, but there seems to be now a completely different picture, a completely different environment. Can we pinpoint it to a particular time that happened?
Yeah, great question. About 10 years ago, approximately, that was the pivot from one of engagement for about 40 years since 1972, when President Nixon visited China and signed kind of the Shanghai Communique, where the countries pledged to work together. There were about 40 years of engagement and working together, and that pivot from engagement to competition and potentially confrontation happened about 9+ years ago, so almost a decade.
So who drove that change?
This was initiated under the first President Trump's term. However, the policies have continued largely under President Biden as well. There's a saying in DC that the Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much, but one thing they do agree on is being tough on China.
Yeah, and maybe about Israel also. They seem to be agreeing on that. Those two things. So, is the U.S.-China relationship or tension, let's say, truly about kind of a rising power versus declining power conflict, or is that kind of an oversimplification?
Yeah, great question. For 4 years, I sat at the nexus between national security and civil liberties. As the former president of Committee of 100, we kind of championed the causes of Chinese Americans, the 5 million of us who look Chinese, who happen to be caught up in this deterioration in relations between the two superpowers, especially as evidenced during COVID times, when there were thousands and thousands of cases of anti-Asian hate and violence, resulting in killings, in beatings of families, etc. So that's kind of the context. I was sitting, discussing this in the White House, or discussing this at the Department of Justice or Department of State and at the congressional offices. It's not if China is a threat. China is a threat to America, but what kind of threat is it? An analogy is simple. If it's a Category 5 hurricane, you better get in your car and get out the way, right? But if it's a Category 1 hurricane, you lock your windows, close your doors, should be okay. And today, there's such a hysteria over China that everything is seen as Category 5. And therefore, our measures, Americans' measures, responses become unmeasured, and many times to our detrimental to our values and competitiveness. 10 years from this pivotal moment that you asked about, that the U.S. changed its relations with China, are we more secure? Are our values more enhanced and our competitiveness improved from 10 years ago? I've never gotten a yes answer. Every single person I've talked to have said that 10 years since we pivoted, our policies changed, that we are less competitive, our securities are less secure, and our values have been diminished. So I want to take this approach today, and this is the approach I took in this book I wrote, Rethinking China, which is a results-focused approach. Having had now 10 years of data and evidence, let's look into the data and evidence and see if America is getting the results that it wants. Because, good intentions are good, but good intentions don't equal good results. And we know the road to ruin has been paved with good intentions. So another thing I really want to focus on today is really share the data and the evidence as I dug into and spoke to 300+ experts across the United States in places like Harvard, Yale, in all the levels of government to all the previous U.S. ambassadors to China, I realized the data and the evidence are very clear that the assumptions under which we have pivoted, many of them are false and many of them are misleading. And therefore, the courses of actions we've taken have not advanced our own values and interests, but instead have hurt us.
Very interesting. So, when we make decisions, we make them, we hope, we think we make them on being informed on the data. We need accurate data to make those decisions. But what you're saying is that the data seems to be either manipulated, incorrect. Which the data that led to this disengagement from China. So let us go into that. What are the assumptions that were made that resulted in that disengagement, and how does that match to reality?
Great question, right? There are four big areas, I would say, of violent discord between the U.S. and China. One area, obviously, is in economic trade, right? The idea,
that's what Trump is all talking about, right?
Exactly.
Trade,
and the idea of the China shock, which took away 4 million manufacturing jobs and left many parts of Middle America hurting even today. The second is intellectual property theft, the idea that the Chinese got to where they are by stealing American technology. The third is human rights, that fundamentally this is a struggle between democracy and autocracy. Obviously, many people view it, if you phrase it that way, as a struggle between good and evil, existential struggle to the death. And then lastly, it's one around Taiwan and a potential nuclear confrontation between the two superpowers. So I want to preface, by saying another thing I think most people shy away from. We are at war with China today. The U.S. is engaged in a media war, in a currency war, in a technology war, and most people believe in a proxy war over Ukraine. The only war we're not engaged in today is a kinetic war, an armed conflict involving two nuclear superpowers, right? And we are dangerously close to sleepwalking into that war. So I'll give you some examples of the wars that America sleepwalked into with false assumptions. We went into Iraq under the assumption that there were weapons of mass destruction. They weren't. We went into Afghanistan under the assumption that in order to defeat Al-Qaeda, we must defeat Taliban. That was not true, right? And, harking back to the Vietnam War, we went into Vietnam believing the assumption that if South Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall, just like dominoes, right? Which was not true. When South Vietnam fell, Thailand did not fall, Indonesia did not fall, Philippines did not fall. Nobody fell in Southeast Asia. So, the key thing today is, hopefully during our conversation, is to have a chance to talk about some of these assumptions.
Yeah, which America seems to be very good at, unfortunately, to sleepwalk into those wars. So let's go through each of those four items, please, because they're very interesting.
Sure. The first one, U.S. and China have this huge trade deficit, hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Which is very true. But if you look at the full numbers, it's about $1.2 trillion in trade between the two countries. This is about a couple of years ago. Today, with the tariffs, it may be, jumbled up a little bit, but it's largely true. 600 billion is actually export import. And then 600 billion is actually American businesses doing business in China. And then Chinese businesses doing business in America. So 600 billion, roughly.
Like the McDonald's, the Apple,
exactly,
the Starbucks.
The McDonald's, the Starbucks, exactly, doing business in China. And then the other one I've talked to you about is the 4 million jobs that's lost doing what most people would call the China shock. Right, the 4 million manufacturing jobs. Those are the two numbers I want us to discuss. First is the 1.2 trillion, and then the other is the 4 million manufacturing jobs. Now, I talked to, all the authors, MIT, Harvard professors who wrote the China Shock book, and then of course many economists who've done research since. It is true, 4 million manufacturing jobs were lost in America. But the second part of their research that's not been covered at all is that as many, if not more, jobs were created on the coastal cities. So perfect example they give is Apple, right? Apple outsourced all their manufacturing to Foxconn based in China. However, with that savings, they created so many jobs in engineering, in marketing, in design, except mostly in the coastal areas. The key takeaway, having talked to all these economists, is not that China was a net loss in jobs for America. Most economists would actually agree it's a net gain. China's entrance into the American supply chain was a net gain for American jobs. But the key insight is that the distribution of that gain was very uneven. The middle of America, where people are less mobile, less educated, suffer the most. While, on the coastal sides where people are more educated, more mobile, benefited the most. So if we, as Americans, do not address this fundamental question, even if we take out China, where are these companies going to? They're going to India. Even if we take out India, they're going to the Philippines. They're going to Malaysia. They're going to Indonesia. We have to, at home, address the fundamental issue that all these economists and data scientists have discovered, which is not that China was the destroyer of American jobs, but that the benefits and the drawbacks of globalization aren't even. And without addressing that at home, we're not going to be able to help our people.
Because that's a very important thing. This is an issue that I think a lot of the Western world is facing. I'm based here in the UK. There's a big topic happening right now about immigration, for example. But I feel at the heart of it there's economic drivers that are causing this. There's kind of a replacement of the working class from the working class in the UK or in the US, working class in China and those jurisdictions. And people are suffering because of that, right? But that's not because of anything that China did. It's just kind of the structure of capitalism, which is, capital will also flow to where how we can produce this in the cheapest way possible to provide that to the consumer. And a lot of people benefit from that. Obviously, China benefits from that, and people to your point, in the US and in the Western world benefit from that. But it's that middle class, the upper class that are rewarded, whether that's because they hold assets that appreciate because of the value increasing by reducing the cost, or them having different jobs as opposed to the previous jobs 20, 30 years ago. But there's a big chunk of the population not participating in that wealth creation. And that is causing a huge political issue here in the UK and the US, where we're seeing more conflict. And it's almost like the fabric of society is getting destroyed because we're pointing fingers at each other of whose fault is this, when it's this issue that which you've described.
Yeah, no, this is exactly the point. This is not just something facing the United States. I think it's facing almost all developed countries, right? Because globally, capital does flow where they get the best bang for the buck. And unfortunately, the people who are less mobile, less educated, many times in the middle of the country, or I guess in England's case, maybe outside of London, kind of gets stuck, right? And without thoughtful policies, it's just easy for these people to get stuck generations from now.
Your point is the failure is not a failure of our relationship with China. It's actually a domestic policy of how do we reinvest the rewards into spreading the benefit.
Exactly. And this gets to the second point of, it turns out the trade imbalance isn't that imbalanced if we actually put all the profits that American companies make in China back into the United States. And, credit to President Trump, he tried to do a little bit of that in the first term. But unfortunately, today, most of the profit that's being made by American companies, not just in China, but elsewhere around the world, don't come back to the United States. So even though it's a $1.2 trillion trade with about 600 going one way and 600 going another way, the bulk of what American companies make in China never comes back. And so we see this huge trade imbalance, except it's, it hides the real reality of we're not getting our companies to take the profits they make overseas and bring it back to reinvest in the areas we need them to reinvest. That's a topic that if we avoid, we will never get better, because we can take out China, they're still going somewhere else, right? If American companies are incentivized to go somewhere else, because as to your point, capital always flows to where they get the most bang for the buck, they're never coming back. Right. And without the right incentives, they're never going to come back and invest in the communities that need it the most.
Yeah. So it's really a failure from the government, from here, the government or the US government, which is very interesting. So that's the first one. It's kind of the data around the outsourcing and the trade doesn't actually match to what's driving that mismatch there. What's the second one?
All right. The second one is the IP, right? Look, I worked 7 years at Intel. I was the youngest managing director at the time. I was an entrepreneur in China, starting my own company. I had a competitor steal IP from us. So I'm intimately aware of the risk and the importance of protecting IP. The Chinese steal from America about $600 billion in IP. That's a big number, right? So as I looked into the number, I realized it's a myth. The number is basically an OECD approximation of IP loss as a percentage of GDP. So OECD approximates about 3% of GDP loss. So $20 trillion economy times 3%, $600 billion.
The 3% you said, is that applied just to China?
Any country.
3%.
Any country,
wow,
yeah.
okay.
You could take China and put 3% on it and say, oh, 3% is lost, right?
Okay.
Of course, it's OECD, so they largely apply to OECD countries.
Yeah.
But it's really just that vague of an approximation. So after talking to all the experts in this area, they've calculated that real IP theft, like actual IP that's, technology, etc., it's about 30 billion. Now, 30 billion is still a huge number. Adi, don't get me wrong. But that's very different from 600 billion. That's 96% different from 600 billion, right? This goes back to my first point of what kind of threat is China? Because we need to respond accordingly, right? If it's 600 billion, of course we got to respond it one way. And if it's 30 billion, we respond another way. And I'll tell you what happens when we make those wrong assumptions. We respond disproportionately. So because of that $600 billion number, under the first Trump administration, thousands of Chinese American scientists were ensnared in this campaign called the China Initiative. The first time the American government focused exclusively on one country, the thousands of Chinese scientists who were investigated, hundreds of cases were brought under the China Initiative. And the MIT Tech Review did a review. We worked with them. 0 cases were found to be economic espionage.
A lot of people will not be aware of this. So is it basically the government saying who's Chinese and are they connected to the Chinese government and how deep are they in our institutions?
The China Initiative was basically saying anybody who worked in academics who had any dealings with China is suspect, and let's look over them because they might be sharing sensitive information to the Chinese.
That's like basically,
which, by the way,
like during the Cold War with Russia was kind of a similar thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. By the way, which, couple of premises, which if you talk to any scientist, they'll go, oh my God, that's just incredulous because one, scientific collaboration by nature is open because you publish everything in peer-reviewed journals. Yeah. You have to be open. And so there wasn't sharing of, secret technology, etc. And then the second is all these scientists were encouraged by their institutions to do this collaboration because all the research actually show America benefits more when they collaborate overseas. We actually get, better results because we do this internationally. Right? America is 1/5 the size of China. We produce less than, 1/5 of the STEM graduates. We are able to compete and be the world's best because we attract the world's best talent. People like Elon Musk. People like the person who's Eric Yuan, who started Zoom, right? People like Jerry Yang, who started, Yahoo. The list goes on, right? And what we are doing is we're basically hurting the one thing that makes us, competitive by driving away all that talent. Research has found 30% of the world's top AI researchers are ethnic Chinese. If you look at Meta's, now newly constituted superintelligence lab, it's pretty much the leading, 10, 12, AI researchers are all ethnic Chinese. When I started at Intel, we had the legendary CEO, Andy Grove, who was still CEO. He said, my best IP, isn't the IP I have on my computer. Because, IP gets updated every 12, 18 months, right? Look at your cell phone. My best IP comes to work at 9 a.m. and leaves at work at 5:30. And I got to do whatever I do to keep them. This is America's secret sauce. And right now, what I'm really scared is we're actually really hurting our own secret sauce.
Yeah, 100%. I had a manager once that said to me, every business is a business of people. Because we're a people business. So whatever product you provide, really, it's the people that provide everything that you do. The interesting thing is this is not just happening to Chinese Americans now in the U.S. It's happening across the board under Trump for many other ethnicities. And I think for us in the UK, we're looking at this and we're seeing, can we actually leverage this? Because we want talent. Every country wants talent because it knows that's where innovation comes from. That's where competition comes from. That's where growth comes from. And the idea is that that benefits society as a whole. What's the third?
Third is human rights. Because the fundamental question I first asked is, look, I'm American. I believe in American values, just like you're British. You probably believe in British values, which may or may not be different from American values. I talked to a German who believes in German values, et cetera, et cetera. But I said, what are the fundamental values that we all should subscribe to when it comes to human rights? And how do we make sure that we as a country stand up for those values anywhere around the world? This is something that all countries, including China, Iran, North Korea, etc., signed up for. And this is the basis for how we can push for human rights across the world, including in China, whether it be, for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, for the Tibetans in Tibet, etc., right? Yet, unfortunately, as you could tell, we haven't been doing a good job upholding international systems that we help create. And without the basis for an international system, right, a system of rules and orders that everybody subscribe to, it is very hard to have the moral authority to talk to people about human rights, especially universal human rights. And second to that, we've sanctioned North Korea on nuclear weapons. Well, they're building more nuclear weapons. We've sanctioned Iran on nuclear development. They continue to do it. We're sanctioning Russia on Ukraine. Well, let's see how the war continues. And we sanctioned China now on Hong Kong, on Tibet, on Xinjiang. But to no avail. So another thing that I realized very quickly is on human rights. Again, I think the intentions are good, but we are not getting the results we want. There's no change in behavior. There's no helping the people we actually want to help. And that for me fundamentally is unacceptable, because if we are a proponent of human rights, we got to make sure that our good intentions actually match good results. And some of the research actually show that when done inappropriate, good intentions actually drive worse treatment to the affected communities in those countries.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, sanctions, they mainly hurt the people at the end of the day, because the class, the political class, are usually not impacted by the sanctions. It's the people that suffer under those sanctions. So it's to your point, because there are some issues happening in China, but it's very difficult for the U.S. to come and dictate things when you look at the actions of the U.S. and you're asking, do you have the right to kind of say these things given your record of what you've done? So it's very interesting. But at the same time, a lot of people have that issue with China around this specific topic, because they're thinking, okay, do we want a powerful country to grow more powerfully, where it suppresses dissent, it censors internet, it detains, minorities? Should we fight that economically and not allow that to grow, if that's even a possibility, or should we just accept it? I think for a lot of people, that's a question that they're facing.
Yeah, and which is a good question. But as you know, when it comes to politics, there's always there's many times a false binary. One or the other. Either we fight it or we accept it. I do think there's actually many different ways of combating and speaking up against human rights abuses. Right? Research has found that kind of international kind of opinion does matter a lot to most countries, including big countries like China. So kind of private but public kind of opinion does have a lot of influence, right? There's a lot of things we can do besides just saying either economic sanctions or we just give up. And today, I think that's the false binary that we're presenting. And I think that's the unfortunate one, right? If we want to speak quickly, because this is, for me, is very important, because look, I wouldn't like if somebody else came in, like a French person came in and accused Americans of, being bad or XYZ, right? Even though there's many areas that Americans today, we want to improve ourselves, but nobody likes it when somebody else comes in, right? And I think that's only, I think, tolerable from a human, you know, nature perspective is if the person says, but this is something you've agreed to. This is something you want to live up to, and you're not living up to your own promises and your own expectations, right? And that's something that's hard to argue against. And this is why having that universal declaration, having that system where everybody signs on to something and hold each other accountable is so important, especially when it comes to something like human rights, because it happens somewhere else, right? We can do our best, but it's very hard to affect change there unless they have to, or they need to, or they feel the compulsion.
So that's interesting. And the fourth one, which you mentioned, which is Taiwan, which I think is very interesting because for me it's the most confusing one. So maybe you can elaborate on what's going on there.
Yeah. Well, look, both countries have embarked on probably one of the largest militarization.
China and
Both
US, you mean? Yeah.
U.S., yeah, both in conventional weapons, but less talked about is in nuclear stockpiles. Both countries have, um, in the name of deterrence, right? Both countries have said the military buildup is important to kind of discourage the possibility of war.
Yeah.
Now
But just on that,
we've seen many
the comparison, I mean, still, America spends more on military than the next 10 countries combined, right?
Oh yeah,
Was,
no, there's no comparison. I think China is most likely the closest near peer competitor to the United States. Although I do want to put it in context, right? China is 5 times the U.S. population, but only 70% of the GDP. So on average, Americans are probably 7 times more productive as the average Chinese. I want to put it in context because everybody now paints China as, this behemoth, but in comparison, the US is still much larger. And most economists don't think the China can actually surpass the US in GDP until 2050, if not ever, right? Because of the declining demographics of China. So that's important to put in context. But going back to the potential conflict in Taiwan, the first thing we have to realize is, Taiwan, at a population about 20 plus million, is smaller than the city of Shanghai. Taiwan's GDP is smaller than the GDP of Shanghai, one city in China, right? Taiwan does not have any chance of defending itself, unlike Ukraine, without the active military participation of the United States. Right? This is not another Ukraine where we just provide equipment, we provide intelligence, we provide diplomatic support, and the Taiwanese can fend off the Chinese. No, the Taiwanese has zero chance unless the U.S. directly engages the Chinese in any military conflict. So that's the first thing. And there's been a lot of war games that have been done. Most of them are classified, private, but there are a couple credible war games. And I've talked to the authors of these war games. And even in those cases, with the Americans win the first battle with catastrophic losses on both sides, the U.S. will lose a couple of aircraft carriers, hundreds of aircrafts, etc. Even if the U.S. wins the first battle, I always ask, what happens to the first battle after the first battle? Because the Chinese are not going to give up, right? Nobody can answer me that question because then the escalation path is so scary, right? Because then, well, if you keep fighting, do you bomb, the shipyards and the naval bases in China, which are located to civilian populations? If you bomb their mainland, will they also bomb U.S. territories? And if you start bombing each other, what about the use of nuclear weapons? Like nobody can actually answer those questions because it becomes so scary. If the consequences are so dire, what are the assumptions upon which we want to engage in this potential conflict, right? Because we want to prepare for it, but we also want to know that if we ever need to fight for it, what are we fighting for? What are Americans fighting for? The first answer I got was, well, because Taiwan's a democracy. Right? And then I said, well, we have a lot of democracies in the world,
yeah.
right? But we don't fight for every democracy.
Yeah.
Okay, so that
I've heard that one for Iraq too.
yeah. And then the second one I hear is, well, because Taiwan has the chips. Now, I work for Intel, so I worked in these fabs, right? And I said, well, simply, if you don't want the Chinese to have chips, you just bomb the factories. They're giant, they're giant factories. You can't miss them. Or these fabs, they rely on U.S. equipment and U.S. software. You stop importing those, the fabs aren't going to make anything in a few weeks or
But
even
just sorry
a few days.
on that, wouldn't the U.S. get severely damaged by that? Because I think Taiwan supplies 90% of the semiconductors, and the U.S. uses that. So if that's gone from the supply chain, the U.S. would be harmed.
Well, the truth is everybody will be harmed.
Yeah.
U.S., China, everybody, right? And and here's the interesting thing: if you engage in a war with China, do you think the fabs will still be running? If there's a war, the fabs are gone anyways, right? So to say that we're fighting because we want to save the fabs or save the chips just does not make sense. I mean, on day one of any conflict, those factories aren't going to be pumping out, chips that's going to be sent around the world, right?
Wow.
So, in the end, nobody could answer me this question of why will we fight? And this is something I am quite concerned about because America has got into a few wars, like we talked about, without clear angles. And the problem without clear angles is after a while, we wouldn't know what we're fighting for. And today, I haven't gotten a good answer on why will we fight in Taiwan, even though it is most likely a catastrophic fight that would be huge loss of American lives and treasures.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very fascinating going through those assumptions and the possibility of where it could lead if we continue with those assumptions. From your perspective, I mean, what do you feel Xi ultimately wants for China? Is it regional dominance? Is it the power to set global rules, or is it simply just stability and growth?
Yeah. So great question, Hadid. And in the future, you might get speakers on your show that might opine about the intentions of President Xi. Uh, in the book, I actually talk about this at length, which is clear answer is, I can tell you what I think, but nobody knows. And the best analogy for this is President Trump has been in the public eye in America, in the world for decades now, right? First as developer, then as TV celebrity, and then as a politician. And even today, Americans are pretty much split over what they think his intentions are. Some believe that he's a true patriot, trying to make America great again. And some people think that he's a dictator, basically bringing the American democracy to ruin, right? Almost completely split. So as I talk to professors who actually wrote about intentions, realize it is incredibly difficult to discern somebody's intentions. And it's almost always that we get it wrong, right? Because we always think, either somebody's intentions are bad, where perhaps they're neutral, or they don't even care about us and they're trying to handle their own domestic issues. Or maybe their intentions are good, but the results are bad, right? It's just almost always impossible to discern somebody's true intentions, especially when they don't have, the kind of the motive to actually tell people clearly what their intentions are. And even when they do, people may or may not believe them, right? Some people believe that President Trump has been very clear with his intentions, and some people think that he's never clear, right? So in my book, and I stress this a lot, is we need a set of strategies and set of assumptions and corresponding courses of actions that will safeguard our interest and our values, regardless what China's intentions are. They could be friendly, they could be unfriendly, but our set of assumptions and courses of actions should protect us and defend us regardless, right? So that this is why it kind of goes back to, if we focus on making sure that, the gains of globalization is better distributed across the United States. If we train our people to actually be able to take on the jobs of the future, if we focus on attracting the world's best talent so that the innovation of tomorrow happens in America, if we actually live up to our own values and create an international system where everybody holds each other accountable for those, and if we build up our military to be strong, that allows that strengthened military to help us get our results through diplomacy, then we don't care what China does. We don't care what their intentions are. We wouldn't care what President Xi wants or not want, because we are protected in every situation, in every scenario.
Makes sense. I mean, you've lived in China, you've lived in the US, you've spoken to and engaged in both societies. What do you feel? What are the advantages that China has over the US, and what are the advantages that the US has over China?
Yeah, great question. And I think this gets to one of my central points in the book. Actually, this is kind of what the books look like. Rethinking China, and and this whole point is when America loses, if America loses, it doesn't mean China wins, right? America loses only when we lose our own, our own recipe to success. We only lose when we stop playing our own game and start playing some other people's games, right? And this is kind of a point of where we go back to what makes America successful in the past. America has a very well-trod recipe for success, and I think this is something that we need to continually remind ourselves so that we can go back to it. What is that recipe? One is it has a rule of law, right? People actually believe that when they come here, they can have the opportunities that they were promised, and through hard work, through dedication, they could be anybody. The second is, the American government has done an amazing job in fostering innovation, right? And fostering collaboration with industry by providing a framework, a regulatory framework that tries to protect American consumers from the excesses of the market, because we know capitalism is not perfect, but gives everybody a fair chance to compete and win based on their merit. That's one. The second is a deep collaboration and funding of basic and long-term research through national labs and collaborations with universities. And then the third is, America, I think by the values we live, is still seen as a beacon on the hill. Today maybe some people disagree with some of the things that America does, just like a lot of Americans may or may not agree with some of the things that are happening. However, I think, as an American, I can say most Americans still really believe in the American ideal, that all men are created equal here, that all men have an opportunity, all men and women have an opportunity to be the best they can be in this country. So those are things that make America very, very special. And I think if we go back to it, it's hard for me to see how we lose. Because look, unfortunately, because of some of our policies that you alluded to, we're driving talent away from America. If not for that, people are still coming to America. People want to come to America, right? So, I wouldn't do anything to damage what made us special. With regards to China, I think this also goes to some of the assumptions that we had, unfortunately, in the US. I spoke with a former uh, director of China in the National Security Council, and, he said, oh, the Chinese, they're good copiers, but they're not good innovators.
Mm.
And I think that's premised on this idea that because their political system is not as free as ours, they cannot innovate as well as us, right? There's this interesting assumption that basically says, if you don't have a free political system, how are you going to be able to have, free innovation? Well, unfortunately, that assumption is not entirely correct today, right? Today, the Chinese are innovating. They are hungry and they're innovating. And that's something that we really have to turn our heads to and focus our eyes on, because without understanding that the Chinese are innovators and hungry to achieve, we basically focus on the issues of yesterday, which is, oh my gosh, they're copying us, they're stealing from us, without realizing that they're innovating and moving ahead of us. Again, I go back to the idea of results orientation. In 2015, China came out with this thing called Made in China 2025. The beauty is it's been 10 years. It's 2025. So we can look at the results of what have the Chinese achieved in those 10 years. In 2015, they identified 10 sectors. And by the way, the US government made this a big issue and tried in many ways to stop and slow down the progress that the Chinese were going to make in those 10 sectors. In those 10 sectors, according to the US Chamber of Commerce, at least 4 sectors, the Chinese are now world leading, right? Including EVs, renewable energy, advanced materials, high-speed rail, and in at least 3 or 4 other sectors, they're almost catching up and on par with the United States. Right? It is because the Chinese are innovating. And this is why something that we have to really, really, kind of shift our attention to, because the U.S. experienced this before. In the 1980s, the Japanese came in, and it made it felt like the Japanese were going to take over the world, right? And there were a lot of talk about, Japan Inc. and the demise of the American economy. But instead of just getting fearful, the American companies and the American consumers got and American entrepreneurs got curious. We started actually copying the Japanese, right? We realized, oh, continuous improvement. That sounds good. Let's apply it to our systems and programs, right? This is how we beat the Japanese. And so this is one of those pivotal moments that we have to move from those old assumptions of the Chinese are just copiers and stealers to they are innovating and they are hardworking and they are hungry. And the only way we can outcompete them is not only get the best talents, but to learn where we're falling behind and to actually get their best knowledge so we can move ahead.
Yeah, that's agreed. I think it's the issue is, to your point, the U.S. is getting distracted and not focusing on what it does very well, which is the points that you've highlighted very, very well. Z, it's been fascinating speaking to you. If people wanted to reach out to you, get your book, where can they do that?
Yeah, no, thank you. So we do have a website called rethinkingchina.us. So the word rethinkingchina.us. Anybody could subscribe. You get a free download of a chapter, and you'll get all the updates, and you'll be able to contact and have a conversation. I wrote this book because as I delved into this, I realized the reality does not accord with what we've been presented in the media. And the results are not equal to the words. And again, good results are not the same as good words and good intentions. And today, after 10 years of that fundamental pivot, we have to have a chance to rethink our approach to China, because they tell us more about ourselves and what we need to do than anything we need to know about China.
Yeah. I mean, just lastly, what do you hope the U.S. does when it comes to or what kind of relationship you hope the U.S. has with China?
Well, I hope as my the full title says, challenging our economic assumptions and opportunities for lasting prosperity. I think we, meaning all Americans and hopefully everyone in the world, will get to enjoy a world free of wars, especially devastating wars
We
involving
definitely need that.
nuclear wars, right? That's the first thing we need, because I hope that we're past the point of having these really devastating wars. And then the second is, can we foster a world where we could all live in lasting prosperity? Because the truth is, the pie is getting bigger and bigger, partly because of the ability to be able to trade with each other, partly because of technological innovation. But people are getting more and more anxious. People are getting more and more worried about their future. And there's this huge disconnect. And disconnect is not just happening in the US or in England. It's happening in China as well, right? It's happening everywhere, where the pie seems to get bigger and bigger every year, but people are getting more and more worried about their future, their stake in this growing pie. And so I think this is an issue, a task affecting all of humanity. And in some of these monumental tasks involving climate change, nuclear nonproliferation, AI, global migration, and then potentially kind of the ability to have a balanced development. These are issues that probably require the leadership of both the US and China as the two world's largest economies.
100%, and we hope we move towards that very soon. At the least, just to avoid that kinetic war that we want to avoid at all costs. Z, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.